Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Pope of Physics, Enrico Fermi and the Birth of the Atomic Age, by Gino Segre and Bettina Hoerlin. Narrated by Tim Campbell. Prologue. Trinity. July 16th, 1945. Dawn broke reluctantly, the early rays of the day barely grazing the tops of nearby peaks. It was almost as if the sun sensed that its brightness would be outshone. A group of scientists, huddled together against the morning chill, set aside their worries about bad weather and concentrated on the seismic event that was about to occur. The countdown began at 5:09:45 a.m. If all went according to plan, exactly 20 minutes later they would throw a switch triggering the detonation of the world's first atom bomb. The tension at the site was palpable as they waited. An earthen mound above a concrete slab roof, all supported by massive oak beams, fortified the structure they were staying in. Located 10,000 yards south of the 100-foot-high tower holding the bomb, the shelter was thought to be safe no matter how large the explosion at Ground Zero might be. The small group who manned the Trinity Project, as it was named, included George Kistiakovsky, the head of explosives, Kenneth Bainbridge, the man who had selected and built up the site, and, of course, J. Robert Oppenheimer. General Leslie Groves, feeling that he and Oppenheimer should not be together in case of disaster, had gotten into his Jeep a little earlier and driven 5 miles south to base camp, leaving his military deputy in charge at the bunker. Most of the physicists who had worked on Trinity were at Campagna Hill, some 20 miles northwest of Ground Zero. A few, including Enrico Fermi and Emilio Segre, were 10 miles closer at base camp. Shallow trenches had been dug there to protect them, but would those trenches be enough? Everybody thought yes, but how big was the blast going to be? Might it even be a complete failure? A few days earlier, the senior physicists had started a betting pool about the blast's magnitude. A $1 entrance fee built up the pot. Kistiakovsky's wager had been 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent, a low estimate, as he would discover when he climbed on top of the bunker after the blast, only to be knocked over by the shock wave that reached him a few seconds later. Hans Bethe, head of the theory division, had said 8,000, while a worried Oppenheimer had settled for a modest 300. The switch was thrown at 5:29:45. Many recorded their impressions of what happened next, an event subsequently described as brighter than 1,000 suns. From base camp, Isidore Rabi's memory was that suddenly there was an enormous flash of light, the brightest light I've ever seen or that I think anyone has ever seen. It blasted, it pounced, it bored its way right through you. It was a vision that was seen with more than the eye. The flash was so overwhelmingly intense that irrational instants of fear were common. For a moment I thought the explosion might set fire to the atmosphere and thus finish the Earth, even though I knew this was not possible, Segre recalled. Seconds later, as the mushroom cloud began rising in the sky, those watching it were left trying to grasp the meaning of what they were witnessing. Oppenheimer remembered the lines from the Bhagavad Gita's scriptures coming to him. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Bainbridge expressed himself in much more prosaic language. "Now we are all sons of bitches." Fermi was arguably the physicist most responsible for the world-changing event that had just occurred in the New Mexico desert. There is no documentation of what he was thinking at the time, but there is a record of what Fermi was doing. If you didn't know him, it would seem bizarre, but everybody knew he always acted with purpose. A few seconds after the blast, Fermi stood up and began tearing a large sheet of paper into small pieces, and then dropping them from his upraised hand. 40 seconds later, as the front of the shock wave hit, the mid-air pieces were blown a short distance away. Pacing off the distance to where they landed, some 8 feet, he consulted a little chart he had prepared beforehand. Shortly afterward, Fermi told those around him that he estimated the blast's force as roughly equivalent to 10 kilotons of TNT. A few hours later, Fermi climbed into a special lead-lined tank and headed toward Ground Zero to scoop up material for a more careful assessment of what had transpired. The detailed measurements took about a week. It was concluded that the blast's magnitude, corresponding to 20 kilotons of TNT, was close to the estimate he had made within a minute of the explosion. None of the physicists was surprised. The dropping of the paper pieces soon became yet another vintage Fermi story, adding to the lore of how he could, with the simplest of means, estimate the magnitude of any physical phenomenon. And as usual, he had been right. His colleagues in Rome used to joke that Fermi was infallible, like the Pope. He had acquired the nickname the Pope of Physics early on. It was an appellation that persisted, deservedly, throughout Fermi's lifetime. Part 1. Italy, Beginnings. 1. Family Roots. Enrico Fermi's ancestral roots can be traced to the valley of Italy's greatest river, the Po, whose origins lie in the Western Alps. It flows from west to east, neatly bisecting northern Italy, and finally empties into the Adriatic Sea. As it travels its 400-mile course, it grows steadily in volume, fed by rivers coursing down from the Alps and from ones born in the central Apennine mountain chain. The Po Valley, defined by its river, is agriculturally fertile and culturally vibrant. It is also Italy's economic center, thanks to large industries, but enriched by a wealth of small businesses that have adapted an older tradition of craftsmanship to the demands of the new commerce. Turin, the automotive home of Fiat, is located directly on the river. As it winds further, Milan, a center of style and fashion, is a little north, and Bologna, known for its culinary treats, a little south of its course. Venice, an architectural wonder, is not far from the delta where the Po empties into the sea. These are the region's dominant cities, but there are a number of mid-sized ones with their own history and institutions. In most cases, this diversity comes from their ancient founding during the Roman Empire, and sometimes even earlier, followed by an evolution during the Renaissance into independent city-states. What we currently call Italy, a country that came together only in 1870, was until shortly before then little more than a hodgepodge of smaller fiefdoms wavering opportunistically to and fro in their allegiances to larger European powers. Piacenza, the ancestral home of the Fermis, lies in the midst of the Po Valley. It has a particularly impressive 13th century city hall, but the town is largely neglected as a tourist attraction because it lies almost directly in the middle of a triangle formed by the better-known Parma, Cremona, and Pavia. Founded by the Romans in 218 BCE, the settlement was given the name Placentia from the Latin placere, to please. Through the following centuries it did indeed please, and in doing so underwent the same cyclical sacking and rebuilding that its neighbors suffered. In 1545, the Duchy of Parma and Piacenza was established. Except for a brief interlude during Napoleon's short-lived conquest of northern Italy, it controlled the region surrounding those two cities until the formation of modern Italy. Shortly before that, the Fermis, a local family, made the transition away from tilling the soil. The man who would become Enrico's grandfather, Stefano Fermi, entered the employment of the state and rose to be administrative head of a small municipality adjacent to Piacenza. Enrico Fermi's grandfather married Giulia Bergonzi, a woman 13 years his junior, and began a large family. Their second son, Alberto, would one day become Enrico's father. The fluid national identities that characterized the Italian peninsula in the first years after Alberto's birth in 1857 were such that he entered the world as a subject of the Duke of Parma and Piacenza, became a resident of the Free Territory of Emilia 2 years later, and a citizen of the Kingdom of Sardinia a year after that, and finally, at age 4, became an Italian. All this without ever leaving the vicinity of Piacenza. In the 1840s, Alberto's father, Stefano, had settled with his wife in Caorso, a small municipality that lay 8 miles east of Piacenza. Their life was a simple one, centering on family, work, and church. He and his wife Giulia almost certainly went occasionally to Piacenza, but they probably did not venture as far as Cremona, for though it was only 8 miles west of Caorso, going there required crossing the Po and entering a different country. Those borders vanished in 1861 with the emergence of the Kingdom of Italy. Stefano and Giulia hoped there would be opportunities for advancement in this new country, still woefully underdeveloped by comparison to those of Northern Europe. The Industrial Revolution had for all practical purposes bypassed the peninsula, and most of Italy's workers either labored on the land as they had for centuries, or engaged in minor commerce. Nor was transportation very different from what it had been since Roman times, for there was little more than 1,500 miles of rail lines in the whole country, almost all of it north of the Po. Education was viewed as providing a first step to bettering oneself. More than 3/4 of Italy's population was still functionally illiterate. Many could read a little, but like Enrico's grandmother Giulia, had not learned to write, much less how to deal with arithmetic problems beyond a simple shopping list. The newly formed Italian government instituted a set of reforms designed to change this state of affairs. An innovative law called for universal enrollment in elementary school starting at age 6. Attendance in the first 4 years was compulsory, though in practice the rule was often broken. The poor considered it a luxury to have their offspring removed from the workforce. The rich educated theirs at home. Stefano and Giulia, despite their modest circumstances, insisted on having their children attend school, and Alberto, who seemed to be the most scholastically gifted of them, advanced beyond an elementary education. But given the Fermi family's financial situation, attending university was never considered. When he reached the age of 16, Alberto's schooling was finished, and it was time for him to seek employment. By then, Rome was the capital of Italy. The city and the surrounding region had been an independent state under papal rule until 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy had annexed the territory. Pope Pius IX had declared the occupation violent, unjust, and invalid. Retreating into the Vatican, he refused to recognize the existence, much less the legitimacy, of the new Italy. Alberto Fermi, 13 at the time, must have followed the story with keen interest. His parents, especially his mother, were devout Catholics, but he was already having the doubts that would later turn him into an agnostic, if not an atheist. Alberto knew that he would have to leave Caorso if he was to advance in the world. Working for a company that built and managed rail lines seemed to be a particularly interesting choice in the early 1870s. At the time of his birth, Italy had more than 24 independent railway companies, each operating separate lines. Most of the lines had been founded with foreign capital, making them dependent on events outside Italy's control. Each attempted to maximize its profits with no concern for helping to forge a national identity. By the age of 24, Alberto was employed in the service of the company that managed the Northern Italian railroads, one of the 4 that had emerged from consolidation. Through various reorganizations, the railroads continued to employ him until his retirement. In 1905, he became a civil servant for the Italian railroads, nationalized and combined into a single company, the Ferrovie dello Stato. During all the years of employment, Alberto's willingness to work harder than anybody else, combined with his organizational ability, perseverance, and native intelligence, had led to his steady rise in the ranks. These personality traits would be very much imprinted on his only surviving son, Enrico. Like his father, Alberto did not marry until he was 41. Ida de Gattis was 14 years his junior. The daughter of an army officer, she was born in Bari, a city in Puglia, commonly known as the heel of Italy. Ida had been orphaned at a young age and raised by relatives in Milan. Like Alberto, she strongly advocated self-sufficiency and self-reliance. She began teaching after a 3-year course for elementary school teachers, her ambitious trajectory a relative rarity at a time when women were still discouraged from entering a profession. Ida and Alberto were both intelligent and upwardly mobile. They were not cultured in the traditional sense of appreciating art, music, and literature, though Alberto, a rather taciturn man, was known to occasionally break into song in the privacy of his home when shaving or bathing. His choice was almost always a Verdi aria, probably because the composer was born in Busseto, a small town only a few miles from Piacenza. When Ida and Alberto married, they settled in Rome, on Via Gaeta, a street that lay a short distance from the Central Railroad station. Their apartment was in one of the newer buildings that had sprung up during the 30 years since Italian unification. a period during which the city's population had roughly doubled to some 400,000. Their neighbors were much like the Fermis, upwardly mobile middle-class people, the husbands typically employees of the government or of a quasi-governmental agency. The Fermis lived on Via Gaeta for 10 years, then moved to a nearby apartment in 1908. Slightly more spacious, but still far from luxurious, it had no central heating, and its bathroom, as was not unusual at the time, was equipped with only a sink and a toilet. Baths were taken in 2 zinc tubs, a smaller one for the children and a larger one on casters for the parents. By then, Ida and Alberto had 3 children. Maria was born in 1899, Giulio in 1900, and Enrico on the 29th of September, 1901. The closeness in age of the children, and Ida's desire to continue teaching, resulted in Enrico's being placed in a farm family. The tradition of having wet nurses for infants was centuries old in Italy, usually only adopted by the upper classes. A young woman who had recently given birth would be brought in from the countryside to nurse and care for the baby, living with the family at least until the child was weaned. Toward the end of the 19th century, the reverse was becoming common for middle-class couples living in big cities. Their children were sent to the countryside. With 3 children in less than 3 years, the Fermis made such arrangements for Enrico, the youngest. At the time, farms still existed close to Rome. It was not too hard to find a suitable family, willing, for a fee, of course, to take on a little boy for a few years. A child psychologist ruminating on where such a beginning would lead might conclude that in adulthood the person would be either very self-reliant and controlled, or overly needy and dependent. Enrico was obviously an example of the former. One can speculate that the farm family provided a loving environment and a place where he could observe, explore, and enjoy nature. The security that Fermi exuded, as well as his love of the outdoors, might be related to those farm years. Yet the pain of separation from his family of birth must have affected his development too, and is probably related to why Fermi kept emotions to himself and never complained. This is how he learned to cope. And those coping skills served him well in later life. 2. The Little Match. Il piccolo fiammifero. Enrico's sisters remember him being small, dark, and frail-looking when he rejoined the family at age 2.5. She also recalled how, probably worried by the sudden appearance of all the strangers, he immediately began crying, only to be told by his mother to stop at once. In this home naughty boys are not tolerated. Little Enrico did stop crying. But with bottled-up frustrations, he was known to occasionally break into flaming rages, earning him the family nickname of Piccolo Fiammifero, Little Match. Rages were not tolerated any more than an untidy appearance. Perhaps rules had been slacker in a farm environment. In a city setting, his mother apparently would insist that his face always be clean, stopping at fountains to wash up during their excursions. Despite Alberto and Ida's strictness in child-rearing, the Fermi family appears to have been close, with a special bond developing between the 2 brothers, Giulio and Enrico, only a year apart in age. Alberto and Ida had advanced in their careers, despite not having university degrees. But like many upwardly mobile parents, they wanted more for their children. All 3 of those children, through a combination of natural ability and the self-discipline learned from their parents, excelled in their studies, each of them consistently at the top of his or her class. At the beginning of the 20th century, the advanced school curriculum was still oriented toward a classical education, emphasizing Latin and Italian literature, with Greek added in the final 5 years. Mathematics, history, and science were also taught, but regarded as secondary. In particular, a student preparing for the culminating graduation exam, the so-called maturità, was expected to know practically by heart Dante's Divina Commedia, Italy's national literary treasure. Fermi had little interest in music or visual arts, but a love of poetry, and not only Dante, remained with him. On long hikes, he could occasionally be heard reciting under his breath verses he had learned in his youth. Maria, who would eventually become a high school literature teacher, was drawn to the humanistic side of the studies. By contrast, Giulio and Enrico were more interested in science, or at least in the technical skills they acquired by building models and little electrical motors. The first recognition that Enrico was exceptional occurred shortly after he turned 13. Alberto Fermi, nearing 60, had continued to rise in his profession and had become a chief inspector at the Ministry of Maritime and Railroads. Its offices were located in a building a little less than a mile from the Fermi apartment, and Enrico had started meeting his father at the building's door after work and walking home with him. Adolfo Amidei, a 37-year-old engineer employed in the same office as Enrico's father, often joined them for part of the way, since his apartment was in the same direction as theirs. When Enrico discovered that Amidei had an interest in mathematics, he asked him a few questions about geometry that his father had been unable to answer. To help his colleague's son, Amidei lent Enrico a geometry book. The young boy quickly worked out the solutions to the problems it contained, some of which even Amidei had not been able to solve. Impressed, Amidei inquired of his senior colleague whether anybody else had commented on his son's skill and precocity. Alberto told him that Enrico had always done well in school, but none of his teachers had noted anything out of the ordinary. At about the same time, early January 1915, tragedy struck the family. Giulio had developed a throat abscess that was interfering with his breathing, not an uncommon consequence of a severe tonsil infection. Today, treatment is by massive doses of antibiotics, thereby usually avoiding any surgical intervention. The standard procedure in 1915 was an incision and drainage of the abscess under a local anesthetic. This surgery was performed on Giulio in a clinic, his mother and sister waiting to take him home after the anesthetic wore off. But Giulio had a dramatic adverse reaction to its administration, went into anaphylactic shock, and died on the operating table. The family was devastated. Alberto became even more taciturn, and Ida fell into a deep depression. Giulio, warmer and more outgoing than Enrico, had been her favorite. Ida's fits of inconsolable crying lasted for hours, and she was in no shape to help alleviate the pain of others. Enrico was left to grieve on his own. To prove to himself that he was not a total wreck, a week later he deliberately walked by the clinic where his brother died. It was a striking example of Fermi's early need for emotional control. One way for 13-year-old Enrico to fill the traumatic and heartbreaking void was by hard work. Amidei, recognizing both the boy's loneliness and his eagerness to learn, tried to do what he could by continuing to lend him books. The more he did, the more impressed he was by Enrico's intelligence and thoroughness. When Amidei once asked his young protege if he wanted to keep a calculus book he had lent him, he was told that it wasn't necessary, because he had thoroughly assimilated the material. As people would repeatedly say over the next 40 years, when Fermi knew something, he really knew it. Another precious balm for Enrico was having a schoolmate of Giulio's become his close friend. Enrico Persico shared his interests in science and in building mechanical objects. The two of them soon began taking long walks together, discussing their common dreams. 15 years later, the two Enricos would be Italy's first two professors of theoretical physics, and almost 40 years later, they would still take long walks together and share dreams. The young Fermi, insatiable in his quest to learn more about science, found his first real physics book in Rome's Campo dei Fiori, literally Field of Flowers. This square, located between the Tiber and the ruins of Pompey's Theater, the site of Caesar's assassination, remains to this day one of Rome's liveliest areas. Now a popular outdoor food market, during Enrico's childhood it was a horse market 2 days a week, and once a week held stalls where one could purchase new and old books. Most of them were novels, or this being Rome, theological treatises. Occasionally one might find something else. One day in late 1915, the two Enricos were looking through the collections in the Campo. Fermi picked up a 900-page, 2-volume set entitled Elementorum Physicae Mathematica. It was a text on mathematical physics written in the 1830s by a priest named Andrea Caraffa, who had taught science and mathematics in the Collegio Romano, a Roman university founded in the 16th century by the Jesuit order. With more than 4 years of intense study of the language completed, Enrico had no problem with the Latin text. In any case, all the equations were in the universal language of mathematics. Purchasing the book with his allowance, Enrico studied it carefully in the weeks that followed, making notes when he had questions. Caraffa's subject matter was early 19th century physics, chiefly the mechanics of celestial motion and wave theory. The mathematics Carafa employed might have provided an insurmountable obstacle had Enrico not already studied the subject on his own, with books lent by Amidei. Not only was Fermi the only 20th century physics genius to be entirely self-taught, he surely must be the only one whose first acquaintance with the subject was through a book in Latin. At 16, Enrico skipped his final year of high school. It was time for him to begin thinking about what would come next. Obviously headed toward a university, Enrico was expected to stay at home, since Italian universities had no dormitories. But Amidei felt his young protege would benefit greatly from being away from the oppressive atmosphere that dominated the Fermi household after Giulio's death. Once again, Amidei's important role in Fermi's development surfaced. He was familiar with an elite institution in Pisa, the Scuola Normale Superiore. Admission to its small entering class, some 40 students in all, was by competition. Amidei was confident that Enrico would shine. Since the school provided room and board for its matriculating students, there would be no additional financial burden on the Fermi family. The classes were mostly big lectures held at the University of Pisa, but additional supervision and instruction would be available in the scuola. Such an opportunity would enrich Enrico both intellectually and emotionally. Discreetly inquiring of Enrico whether he would like to attend, Amidei received an enthusiastic response. He next set out to speak to the boy's parents. They were reluctant, particularly Ida, who felt she would be losing her other son. But Amidei was persuasive in convincing her and Alberto of the benefits to Enrico. He stressed that attending Italy's premier institution of higher learning, a school from which many of the country's most famous scholars, political figures, and writers had graduated, would open many doors for him. Ida and Alberto finally agreed to let him apply for admission. Amidei had also encouraged Enrico to study German. The boy learned French, part of the usual school curriculum, but an increasing body of the scientific literature was in German, and knowledge of that language would stand Enrico in good stead. It was an interesting, although unpopular suggestion, since Italy was at war with Austria and Germany. When World War I began in August 1914, Italy initially opted to remain neutral. This probably would have been the wisest policy to continue, and was generally favored by the population at large. However, in the spring of 1915, the Italian Prime Minister began secret negotiations with the French and British to enter the war on their side. He stoked popular opinion to this end, and in May 1915, Italy declared war on Austria. The Italian army suffered a series of defeats, climaxing in October 1917. During the closing weeks of the war, the Italian army managed to garner a significant victory against a demoralized Austrian army. Fortunately, Enrico Fermi had still been too young to be drafted into the army. Less than 2 weeks after the armistice was signed, he took the entrance examination for the Scuola Normale. 3. Leaning in. Physics and Pisa. Though a superb mathematics student, Enrico Fermi selected physics as his field of study. One of the reasons was his affinity, since childhood, for performing experiments and his fascination with the apparatus they required. His interest in science had started with models and little motors built with his brother. After Giulio's death, he continued in the same vein with Persico, the other Enrico. They gradually embarked on more sophisticated ventures, accurate measurements of gravity's acceleration, water's density, and the level of atmospheric pressure. Part of their work was carried out at the Rome Meteorological Institute, a center Fermi had become familiar with because its director had been his high school science teacher, a man who helped him and Persico build barometers. At the center's library, Fermi found another influential book, denser and more up-to-date than the one he had purchased at Campo dei Fiori. This time French, not Latin, was the tome's language. A 4-volume, 5,000-page encyclopedic treatise on physics, it was then popular throughout Europe. It was written by a Russian physicist, Orest Khvolsin, and had been translated into several languages, though not into Italian. Covering physical phenomena, as well as state-of-the-art instruments, it was remarkably thorough, even by today's standards. Fermi studied Khvolsin at a rapid clip in the summer of 1918, laying the foundation for his astonishing command of every aspect of classical physics. In letters to Persico, he described going through the book at more than 100 pages a day, skipping large sections of material he was already familiar with. At the end of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?